Hello out there in YouTube land, this is Sean, and I'm here to tell you a little bit about building a Ghost Drive kit from StewMac. I've done several of these for people, so I decided to film this last one I did. First thing we'll note is I've already painted the box, so skip that. We can, I'll assume that you can do that on your own, and you can get that whatever color you want, however you want it. Maybe even just leave it plain metal. Okay, so the first thing I do, I go through and I measure all of the components after sorting them out. So I've got all the resistors separated here, got the rest of the components there in the back. And I'm going to go through and literally with my meter test every single one and lay them out and mark them on a little index sheet. That way I can compare how many I have, the values I have to what's in the manual, and make sure everything matches. And then I'm going to mark them in the book that I have the correct amount. And I'm going to write the values over there where they're at, so when I start putting them in, I can pull them in and know exactly what I'm getting. This may seem like it takes a little bit of time to do this for the resistors and the capacitors, but in the long run, if you don't have any problems and don't have to take the kit back apart and try to find where you made a single mistake, it is well worth additional time. The whole recording, me doing this really slowly and carefully and, playing with the phone to record it, took me a couple hours. That's just because I was being really slow, again, for the camera. You could do this in an hour, a little over an hour, if you are familiar with electronics and are just zipping. However, if you're new and haven't done this, maybe even doing it several sessions and taking your time is well worth it, because you'll get a great product. It is a great kit. I really like the sound of it. It's built really, really, really well. Certainly a better deal than trying to find one of these boutique pedals out there that may not even be an accurate reproduction. The one thing they don't tell you about this is it is a Klon to the T. They don't change anything. This is not a modded kit. This is not an alternative version of Klon. This is the Klon circuit as best as it has been documented. You're getting the real deal here. Okay, so having a lead bender there, that's the little blue thing, that lets you bend the leads to go through a circuit board the exact size and distance that you need. Those are only like $2 or $3 from an electronic supplier. If you don't have one, I highly recommend you pick one up. You do need a soldering iron with a very fine tip, because you want to be able to get right down on the actual pad of the board and get that nice and hot, so the solder goes down the lead and into between the lead and the board itself. Note I do all of these individually, just each value, a couple at a time, one at a time, trim them, make sure they're pulled through all the way. There's no bent leads, anything like that. Again, this is all extra time consuming. You could really rush this and make a not good looking version of the pedal that actually functioned fine. But in the long run, again, taking that kit back apart to try to track down where you messed something up is very, very time consuming, and it takes a lot of time. I would recommend you just invest a little bit of patience up front to have a pedal that's going to be trouble-free for many, many, many years to come. Do not skip around in the instructions. Those with the savvy eye will note I actually missed step 2 after painting, which was install the diodes, and I actually end up doing that at the end because I'm like, why am I putting this all together and I still haven't put the diodes in yet? So I did do that. I did place one resistor when I was going through them, and by doing it the way I'm telling you to do it, I actually noticed that and found it because I didn't have the right numbers. That's another reason why to do it this way, because you're essentially double checking yourself and the parts that they sent you from StewMac. So far, again, I've done a bunch of these kits for people. In fact, I keep building them and people buy them from me. So, in fact, I'm not even building this one for me. So I actually do not own a Ghost Drive kit. I have one in a box to build for myself that I have yet to do and we'll get to someday. But for now, it seems I'm building them for everybody but me. But again, go through every single piece, do it exactly in order. If you don't have the greatest eyes, well, let's rewind for a second. On your workbench, you want to make sure that you have lots of light. I have two very large bright lights overhead shining straight down onto the table. So I have lots of light there. But that doesn't change the fact that the markings and bands on the components are extremely small. You'll notice I have a little monocle there, or jeweler's eyepiece, whatever you want to call it, to be able to zoom in and read really, really fine print up close. And I use that several times here. I highly recommend you pick up one of those too if you're going to be working with silicon electronics. And by saying that, I mean things like this pedal and not tube amps. If you're working on a deluxe reverb, you're not going to need something like that. But if you're working on pedals like this, you definitely need that. So when you order your lead bender over there, pick up an eyepiece as well. So the one thing about the board is it's made really, really well, and it's labeled with all of the values on all of the components on the board. But again, it goes back to the text is very, very, very small. You want to look at that very closely and make sure that not only does it look like it's going in the correct position from the pictures in the manual, you want to make sure that the value on the holes you're inserting into matches the value that you have in your hand. Again, it's just one more check to ensure that when you get this all complete after a couple hours, you have a completely trouble-free experience and you have a pedal that's going to last you for years and years. Another thing I can't stress is having a really good pair of cutters and long nose, needle nose pliers. These are not large ones, so the StewMac ones they sell, I have those as well. I usually use those just for changing strings on my guitar. They're a little bit big for this. These, I think the cutters are Klon that I've had probably since the 90s. And I forget what the blue ones are, maybe Craftsman, but I've had those for 20 years at least as well. They're both really, really good. It's worth spending a little bit of extra money. Again, spend $20 on those a piece instead of $5 at Harbor Freight, because the $5 ones from Harbor Freight you won't have in 20 years, promise. Okay, so this one is the capacitors. The electrolytics are really easy because they're marked positive and negative, and note that electrolytic capacitors do have a polarity, a positive and a negative, and if you put them in backwards, they will pop, aka explode. So make sure that you get those inserted correctly. But reading those and sorting those is easy because the values are pretty big compared to the other ones. But the little capacitors, the film capacitors and the ceramic capacitors, the text on those is extremely, extremely small. So make sure you have plenty of light. And again, if you need to, use a magnifying glass, use the little jeweler eyepiece, whatever you want to call that. You can see me doing that, writing these down. Note a couple pieces from the earlier kits that I've had have changed here, and they don't exactly match what is in the manual. If you're familiar with electronics, it's pretty easy to figure out which ones they are. However, if you're not, if your digital multimeter won't read capacitance, it might be worth spending the $20 or $30 to pick up a capacitance meter off Amazon or someplace like that. Then you can actually measure their capacitors and see the exact value of them, regardless of what's marked on them. And you can sort them that way, just like I did the resistors at the beginning. So here I'm going ahead and cutting the wire while my soldering iron's heating up. I'd forgotten to turn it on, so I popped it on. It's heating up. Went ahead and cut the wire. I think there's 6 2-inch pieces, 6 1-inch pieces. You should have plenty. They send extra every time. You can see there's a good bit, probably 6 inches left over. So again, this is putting the electrolytics in. The biggest thing to note here is that they do have polarity. Again, they will explode, they will pop. Your pedal absolutely will not work correctly if you do not get these put in the correct way. So please make sure that you do that. They are marked. Again, there's a stripe down the side with a negative. One lead's longer than the other. Generally, on electronics, the long lead is positive for LEDs, capacitors, things like that, but not always. Make sure you've got it correct. Now, the small film and ceramics are not polarized, so you can put them in either way. But I generally install them so that you can read the text on the PC board the same way the text is on the actual device. So if you're looking at it, you can compare both without having to, you know, flip it in your head or turn it upside down. The general idea of when you're putting a PC board together by hand like this is you start with the smallest, or aka shortest, components first. That way, as you're flipping over and down, you're getting gravity to help you hold these pieces in. So you do the shortest components and then build all the way up to the tallest components. Again, for the idea that every time you flip the board over, it helps you hold the components in place. StewMac recommends buying their little PC board holder, and it's probably a good idea, but I've been building electronics since the 80s, and I've never had one of those, and I don't know what I would do with one if I had it. I would still probably just hold them with my hands. It's so much easier this way to burn yourself, and if you're going to work on electronics, you might as well get used to that. A soldering iron is going to get you sooner or later, so be careful. They are very, very hot. Again, I think on this actual step, what is that, 5, there were 3 components that were labeled differently from the manual. Again, not too hard to figure out once you just kind of realize that's a thing. Again, every kit, and as they get parts, I'm sure is going to change, but for this particular one, I did have that come up. But again, it was pretty easy to figure out. And the pedal did work. You know, spoiler alert, the pedal worked perfectly as soon as I plugged it in. All the controls, everything were exactly as they're supposed to be. Okay, so that's all of the capacitors. Now we're going to do the integrated circuits. Note there are 2 op amps. These are the TLO 72s, and then there's a 1044 charge pump. Do not mix those up, but the 3 sockets they go in are the same. You just need to know that there is they're directional. I started to say aside, almost like positive, negative, but there'll be a little U indentation on one end that is going to be labeled with the paint marker on the circuit board, and there's going to be a dot on the integrated circuit, as well as potentially being the U cut out of the plastic on the actual integrated circuit as well. That way you know that you've inserted it in the correct direction. So again, I believe if you're looking at the 2 op amps, I believe going facing each other is the indentation on these. I don't have the manual open, so I'm not sure, but that's what I remember. And then the charge pump's going out. Again, just make sure you put them in the right way. Easiest way to put the actual ICs in, once you have soldered the sockets in, put one side, all 4 pins in, and then lightly with your thumb or finger push, because they'll probably be sticking out too far. Just lightly push in on the other side until they just barely go in the socket, and then lightly push down. And if you have it lined up correctly, it will slide in very gently. If you have to use any force, you're going to bend the pins, you're going to mess up the socket, you may even break a pin. So again, just take a little bit of time, very gentle, put one side in, gently push the others in until they just start to go in, and then push down very gently. Once it's lined up, it will go right in. So here, just making sure I have everything. Start adding the wires to connect the two parts of the PC board together. This is fun. I think the first try on this, I wasn't paying attention, but I'm pretty sure that it fell off completely without me getting any of them done. So again, just take your time. It can be a little bit of a headache, but it's not too big. One thing I did do here versus the instructions, they say to put the 2-inch leads in first, but I find messing back and forth with that little board for the switch. I think it's easier to put it in first and then do the long ones, but you can do it either way, but that's why I did it backwards here. So this step's not completely necessary, but they have you mount the potentiometers in reverse order because they're upside down when you mount them on the outside. You can see that, volumes and output, So I did not screw these in underneath. It's really not necessary. You don't even have to put them in the holes. You can just literally solder them and get them close enough because there is a good bit of flex in those leads. I would definitely skip, screwing them from the bottom with the nuts and securing them. It's not necessary. It's just a waste of time. Again, you want these to be tightened up pretty good, but a lot of people will over-tighten, and it's really easy to break the potentiometer and the switch. You got to realize those little nuts are not actually that big, so you can't really be torquing on them without tearing something up, and they're also plastic, so it's potential to break the plastic as well. So you want them to be nice and snug, but you don't want to crank them down so hard that they actually break. So just be careful there. So again, this is me going back to step 2 that I mentioned earlier that I'd forgotten to do, which I did. So here I am back, step 2, adding the diodes back in. So 2 are for power supply, I guess. They're power supply diodes. The others are for, I don't know if one's a voltage reference on the op amps. That's what I would guess. I haven't looked at the schematic to know. And then the other 2 are clipping diodes used in the circuit for distortion. And you'll mount those asymmetrically, one pointing one way and one the other. Note the diodes are polarized, just like the electrolytic capacitors. They have a positive side and a negative side marked with the band. You must get those installed correctly, so pay attention to that in the manual. Now, when you're putting the LED in here on this step, note that the LED is polarized as well. So you have the long lead's positive, short lead's negative. If you get this backwards, it won't blow anything up. It's not going to pop or nothing will happen. The light just won't come on, and you'll have to take it back apart and switch it around. Which after you've soldered it, getting it back apart is not necessarily easy, especially if you're new to soldering and working on electronics. So just get it right the first time, but note if you do mess it up, it's not going to break anything. I have my kit, or again, not my kit, but this kit is battery or power. I don't know why you would build one that's power only. Just put in the battery snap. It's the exact same price, and then you can use either or. Even if you never use it, you have that option. With the other kit, you can never run it with the battery, so just get the one where you can use the battery. Again, just be careful, tighten those up, get them nice and snug. Do not crank them down. That is Putting a little bit of solder on the LED there finally, and now we're going to do the actual switch. So what I did there was I used my fingers to hold it down firmly on the switch and just get one tacked with a little bit of solder to hold it in place, and then I went back and did really good solder joints on all of them. Lots of good videos about soldering online. Pro tip I can get is just have preferably a temperature controlled soldering iron. Even the cheap $20 ones these days you can get are temperature controlled. I typically like to use them very hot because cold solder joints are very bad. They crack, they make bad connections, they come loose. And really hot iron makes, you know, the solder flow. You just have to be careful with it because it's easy to, well, burn yourself, but also burn components on the board or get it too hot and break things. But it is easier to solder with once you get used to it. Again, I suppose that's personal preference, but I definitely like to use a very hot iron. So here, just making sure that I have the input and output jacks installed as they are in the manual to match up the wires, as well as the power input plug. The plug that I had was just the input for the the plug input for the power was a little bit different from what's in the illustration. So I think we're already zipped past it, but I did measure that with the meter to make sure which lead was which. But again, all of that works perfectly. So one thing on these is make sure that the wire, when you're doing those output jacks and that, is long enough that you can put them through the hole in the jack and wrap it with your needle nose so that you have a physical connection as well as the solder. You don't want just solder holding those in place. Okay, here's another place where you want to be gentle, putting the knobs on. A lot of people will crazy screw these down and break their knobs. Don't do that. There's no need to. They don't need to be on there like Hercules. And then there's the final plugged in working version. I changed the white or blue LED, whichever it comes with, because I hate them. And put in a yellow, red, whatever, just the old school. I find the white and blue ones are just way too bright when you're using them, especially, you know, on stage or where it's slightly dark. And that's that. So it works great. I'm glad you stuck around and had a look. Good luck with your build.